first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the smell of cut grass and something else. Something sharp, almost medicinal. And a woman's voice saying, very quietly, "Please don't fight me, please." She had both her hands around my left wrist. She was trying to pull something off. I yanked my arm back. Or I tried to. My body wasn't cooperating the way I expected. My arms felt like they were filled with wet sand. The sky above me was gray the way it gets in October in Halifax. That flat, colorless gray that doesn't commit to anything. And there were pigeons somewhere nearby, and a child laughing far off. And I had absolutely no memory of how I had ended up on my back on a park bench. "Your hand," the woman said. She was maybe 65, silver hair pulled back, wearing a green quilted jacket with a Canadian Cancer Society pin on the lapel. She looked like someone's retired school teacher. She looked frightened. "The ring on your hand. I need to take it off. I'll explain everything, I promise, but please let me take it off first." I said, "My son gave me that ring." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very carefully, "I know. My name is Arthur. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the province of Nova Scotia. I have a house in Dartmouth that I paid off 4 years before my wife passed. I have a daughter in Vancouver I talk to every Sunday, and until about 14 months ago I would have told you that I was, on balance, a lucky man. I knew what I had. I didn't take it for granted. My son-in-law, my daughter's husband, is a good man. Calls me on my birthday without being reminded. Came down to help me clear the gutters 2 falls ago without being asked. I have been fortunate in that department. My son is a different story. But it took me a very long time to understand that. His name is Philip. He's 35 and he has a medical degree from Dalhousie and a manner that has always made people trust him instinctively. He has my wife's eyes, that particular shade of hazel that looks green in certain light, and her way of tilting his head slightly when he listens to you, which makes you feel like you are the only person in the room. He got that from her. The charm. The ease. I used to feel proud watching people respond to him. I used to think, look what we made. His mother died 3 winters ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't go into detail about those 14 months because even now I can't do it without feeling like the floor is dropping out from under me. What I'll say is this: after she died, Philip became very attentive. He called more. He drove up from his practice in Bedford on weekends. He sat with me in the kitchen and we drank her tea. Red Rose, she'd never switch brands no matter how many times I teased her about it. And he seemed, genuinely, to be grieving alongside me. I thought we were getting closer. I thought loss was doing what loss sometimes does, pulling people toward each other. I was wrong about what was pulling. It started about 8 months after she died. He came up for a long weekend in November, and he brought a small white box with him, the kind you get from an Apple store or somewhere like that. Inside was a ring. Silver-colored, thin, with a small flat panel on the top. "It's a health monitor," he said. "Tracks heart rate, oxygen levels, sleep. I worry about you living alone, Dad. I want to be able to check in." He smiled. "I set it up so the data comes to my phone. I'll know if anything looks off." I looked at the ring. I thought about the fact that my blood pressure had been slightly elevated at my last GP appointment. I thought about being 61 years old and waking up at 3 in the morning sometimes to a house that was very quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet for 34 years. I put the ring on. "Thanks, son," I said. He nodded and reached over and patted my hand, the way he used to when he was small and wanted to reassure me about something. I thought that was what it was. Reassurance. Care. A son making sure his father was all right. The symptoms started slowly enough that I didn't connect them to anything. First it was the fatigue. I've always been an early riser. 6:15, no alarm, same as my whole working life. But by January I was sleeping until 8, sometimes 8:30, and still feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I blamed the short days. I blamed winter the way you do in Nova Scotia, leaning into that collective understanding that February is just something you endure. Then the headaches. Not sharp ones. A dull, persistent pressure behind my eyes that started sometime in the afternoon and was still there when I went to bed. I bought better reading glasses. I reduced my screen time. The headaches stayed. In March, my hand started trembling slightly. Just a fine tremor, barely visible, but I noticed it when I was trying to thread a needle to fix a button on my coat. I put down the needle and sat looking at my hands for a while. My father had Parkinson's. He was diagnosed at 67. I thought, well, there it is. I thought it the way you think something you've been quietly dreading for a long time. I called Philip. He came up that weekend. He checked my blood pressure, asked me a series of careful questions, looked in my eyes with a small light. He was thorough and calm, and he said, "Your vitals look fine, Dad. How's the sleep been?" I told him. He nodded. "Stress response," he said. He nodded. "Stress response," he said. "Common at this stage of grief. Your nervous system is still processing." He adjusted something on his phone, something to do with the ring's monitoring settings, and told me to keep wearing it. "The data will tell us if anything changes," he said. "Trust the process." I trusted the process. I trusted my son. My friend Dennis noticed before I did. Dennis and I have been friends since we were both on the same rec hockey team in 1987. He was a terrible defenseman, and I was a worse center, and we bonded over our shared uselessness and have been close ever since. He's the kind of friend who will tell you things other people won't, which I value, though I haven't always made it easy for him. In April, he came over for the game. The Mooseheads were in the playoffs, and somewhere around the second period, he muted the TV and looked at me and said, "Arthur, you don't look well." I said I was tired. He said, "You've been tired since Christmas. You're gray. You're moving slow. When did you last see your own doctor?" I told him Philip was monitoring me. Dennis was quiet for a moment. He picked up his beer bottle and set it down without drinking from it. "Philip," he said, "is not your doctor. Philip is your son." I told him that wasn't fair, that Philip had a medical degree, that he was being careful and attentive. Dennis said, "When did you last go outside for more than a walk to the car?" I didn't answer because I realized I actually didn't know. He left early that night. I told myself he was being overcautious, the way Dennis sometimes is. I told myself I knew my own son. I sat in the living room after he left, and I looked at the ring on my finger, and I thought about how Philip had asked me 3 times in the past 2 months, "You're still wearing the ring, right, Dad? The data's important." 3 times. Not once. Not as a reminder. 3 times with a particular attention in his voice that I had interpreted as medical diligence. I thought about it again now, alone in the living room. Then I turned the game back on and told myself I was imagining things. In May, Philip told me he thought I should stop driving. We were on the phone and he brought it up carefully the way he does, sliding the difficult thing into the middle of a conversation so it doesn't seem like the point. He mentioned my fatigue, the tremor, his concern about my reaction times. He said he'd been reviewing my ring data and there were patterns that worried him. He said he'd spoken to a colleague. "You spoke to a colleague about me?" I asked. "Just informally," he said. I wanted another perspective. I asked him what the colleague said. There was a pause. "Early neurological changes," he said. "Nothing definitive, but worth being cautious." Another pause. "I can help you look into power of attorney arrangements, just as a precaution, so things are in order." I said I'd think about it. I hung up the phone and I sat very still in my wife's kitchen with her red rose tea going cold in front of me, and something moved through me that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite fear. It was more like the feeling you get when you're walking in the dark and you suddenly understand you've been walking in the wrong direction for a long time and you don't yet know how far off course you are. I called my daughter. She was worried, asked if she should fly out. I told her it was probably nothing. I didn't tell her about the power of attorney. I don't know why. I think I was ashamed. Not of being unwell, but of something I couldn't yet look at directly. The morning I collapsed in Gorshbrook Park, I had gone out for what had become my version of a walk. Slow, shorter than it used to be. Stopping on benches I never used to need to stop on. The park was quiet. A dog walker in the distance. A woman jogging past with headphones. The October light, doing what October light does in Halifax. thin and silver and a little melancholy. I sat down on a bench near the pond. I remember thinking the water looked very still. I remember the sound of the dog walker calling her dog's name. I remember starting to stand up. Then nothing, a gap. Then the smell of cut grass and the gray sky and the woman with the silver hair and her hands around my wrist. Her name was Helen. She told me that after she convinced me, finally, to let her remove the ring. And it took several minutes, and at one point I nearly pulled away again. Because every reasonable part of my brain was insisting that a stranger trying to remove your jewelry in a park is not normal, until the other part of my brain said quietly, neither is collapsing in a park. She told me she had been watching me for 3 weeks. Not watching in a strange way, she was clear about that. She was a retired nurse practitioner. She walked in Gorsebrook Park every morning, and she had seen me on that same bench route several times, and she had watched the progression with professional eyes she couldn't quite turn off, the color of my skin, the way I moved, the tremor she'd noticed when I was fumbling with my jacket zipper. "I almost didn't say anything," she said. "It's not my place. You could have just been unwell in an ordinary way." She was sitting beside me on the bench now, her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the pond. But I kept thinking about a patient I had, years ago. Similar presentation, the tiredness, the tremor, the cognitive fog that comes and goes. She paused. His wife had been adding something to his food. Something that accumulates. I was very quiet. "The ring," she said, "is not a health monitor. Or it is one. But that's not all it is." She had seen it close up when she was checking my pulse while I was unconscious. She'd recognized the brand. "There's a version of that device that has a secondary function. You need to let a real doctor look at this. A doctor who is not your son." She said it plainly, not cruelly, with the steadiness of someone who has delivered hard news many times and knows that tenderness and directness are not opposites. I looked down at my hand, at the pale band of skin where the ring had been. I thought about the fatigue that started 2 months after I put the ring on. The headaches, the tremor, Philip asking 3 times if I was still wearing it, the power of attorney conversation, the colleague he'd consulted, the patterns he claimed to see in the data, and underneath all of it, under all the explaining I had done, and the reframing and the telling Dennis he was being overcautious. Underneath all of it, a thing I had known for a long time and refused to look at. My son had been waiting for something, and he had been making sure I moved toward it. I went to my GP the next morning. Not Philip's colleague, my own doctor, Dr. Ashworth, who I'd been seeing for 11 years and who has a photograph of her grandchildren on her desk and always asks about my daughter by name. I brought the ring. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "I'm going to refer you to a specialist today, and I'm going to make some calls." The blood work took 3 days to come back. During those 3 days, I stayed at Dennis's house because I didn't want to be alone and I didn't want to be somewhere Philip could reach me easily. Dennis asked no questions and made a pot of soup the first night and let me watch terrible television and sit in his backyard in the cold and stare at his garden. On the 3rd evening, my phone buzzed. It was Philip. He'd called twice already that week, and I hadn't answered. This time his message said, "Dad, I'm getting strange readings from the ring. Can you call me? I'm worried." I read it 3 times. I thought about the man who sent that message. I thought about his mother's eyes. I didn't call him back. The results confirmed what Helen had suspected. A compound that affects the autonomic nervous system, something that, accumulated over months, produces exactly the symptoms I had been experiencing. Fatigue, blood pressure irregularities, the tremor, cognitive fogging, the kind of thing that, in a man of 60 with a family history of neurological disease, would look very much like the beginning of something inevitable. The ring had a secondary bioactive component. It is not, I will say, the kind of thing you can buy at a drugstore. It required knowledge and access and deliberate intent. Dr. Ashworth made the calls she said she'd make. The College of Physicians and Surgeons launched an investigation. The RCMP became involved shortly after. Philip's practice was suspended pending investigation. His colleague, the one he consulted so informally about my power of attorney, turned out to have been Philip's university roommate, and turned out not to have any particular expertise in neurology, and turned out to have been part of a conversation that, in the language of the eventual proceedings, constituted conspiracy to commit fraud. My daughter flew out from Vancouver. She arrived at Dennis's door with a carry-on bag and red eyes, and she held on to me for a long time in the front hallway without saying anything. When she finally pulled back, she looked at my face and said, "Dad, why didn't you call me sooner?" I said I didn't want to worry her. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know." The trial was 11 months later. I sat in the courtroom in Halifax and I watched my son, in a gray suit, very composed, his mother's eyes looking at nothing in particular, and I tried to find something I recognized, some trace of the boy who used to bring me drawings of bridges when I came home from work, because he knew I spent my days thinking about bridges. Some trace of the young man who had sat across from me in this same kitchen after his mother's diagnosis and cried without trying to hide it. I didn't find it. Or maybe I did, and that's why it hurt the way it did. He was convicted on 2 counts. Administering a noxious substance and fraud over $5,000 because the power of attorney, had it been executed, would have transferred control of my assets. The house. The retirement savings. Everything his mother and I had built over 34 years. He was sentenced to 4 years. He'll serve less than that. That part I've had to make a kind of peace with, because the alternative, spending the rest of my life measuring my anger against a system that has its own mathematics, seemed like a way of letting him take more from me than he already had. My health has mostly recovered. The tremor is gone. The fatigue is mostly gone. Dr. Ashworth says, my blood work looks like a different person's, which I take as a good sign. I'm driving again. Last Saturday, I went to a Mooseheads game with Dennis, and we had terrible seats, and the team lost in overtime, and it was genuinely one of the better evenings I've had in a long time. Helen and I have coffee once in a while, at a Tim Hortons near the park. She always orders the same thing, a medium double-double and a plain bagel with butter, and she asks how I'm doing with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman who spent 30 years asking people that question and needing true answers. I always try to give her one. I've been thinking about what I would say to someone in the position I was in, someone who is being told by the person they love and trust most in the world that they are declining, that they need help, that things need to be arranged, and everyone around them seems to agree because the person doing the telling is careful and credentialed and kind in exactly the right ways. I would say, go to your own doctor. The one who has been yours for years, who knows your history, who has a picture of her grandchildren on the desk and asks about your family by name, not the person who is worried about you. Yours. I would say, notice when someone asks the same question 3 times, not because they forgot, because the answer matters to them for a reason they haven't told you. I would say, your age is not evidence of your incapacity. Being 60 does not mean you cannot see what is in front of you. It means you have 60 years of knowing what things feel wrong, and you are allowed to trust that knowledge. I would say the person who saves you might be a stranger in a green quilted jacket in a park on a gray October morning, and if she asks you to let her help you, let her. I stood up in that courtroom and I told the truth. All of it. The ring and the doctor and the months of fatigue and the power of attorney conversation and Dennis muting the game and looking at me and saying, "Arthur, you don't look well." I told it plainly, and I didn't look away from any of it. When I was finished, I sat down. The room was very quiet. I thought about my wife and her red rose tea. I thought about bridges. I thought about the fact that a bridge works not because it fights the weight it carries, but because it distributes it, spreads it across the whole structure so nothing breaks. I'm still here. I'm distributing the weight. That, I think, is enough. I keep coming back to the bench, not the one in Gorsebrook Park where I lost consciousness, though I think about that one too. But the one in Dennis's backyard, the old cedar one he's had since his kids were small, where I sat in the cold for 3 evenings while the blood work was being processed, and I didn't know yet what it would say. I sat there and I watched his garden go dark, and I thought about all the times I had chosen not to see what was in front of me, Not because I was stupid, because I loved my son. There's a version of this story where I blame myself for all of it. I visited that version. I don't live there anymore. What I understand now is that the consequences of Philip's choices were always going to land somewhere. That's not a religious idea. It's just the plain mechanics of how actions move through the world. He made a decision to deceive me, then another to compound it, then another, and each one required the next. The ring required the fake monitoring. The fake monitoring required the fabricated symptoms. The fabricated symptoms required the colleague, the power of attorney conversation, the careful management of my isolation. He built something that could only end one way, and eventually it did. The weight of it found the ground. I think about what it takes to do what Philip did, and I think the answer is that somewhere along the way he stopped being able to distinguish between what he wanted and what was right. That's the thing I find most frightening. Not the malice, but the drift, the slow erosion of the line between his own interests and his ethics. Until the line wasn't there anymore, and he couldn't even see where it used to be. I raised him. I watched him grow. And I still don't fully know when the drift started. What I know is that I almost drifted too. I almost let my love for him override what I actually knew. Dennis told me something was wrong. My own body told me something was wrong. Some part of me knew that evening. After the power of attorney call sitting in the kitchen with the cold tea, I knew, and I turned the game back on, and I chose for one more night not to look directly at it. The hardest thing I've ever done is not standing up in that courtroom. The hardest thing was making myself see clearly when every instinct I had was telling me to trust my son instead. That's what I'd want someone in my position to hold on to. Not just the courage to act once you know, though you'll need that too, but the willingness to actually know. To sit with what your body and your oldest friend and the cold logic of a situation are all telling you, and not flinch away from it. To trust your own mind even when someone with credentials in your mother's eyes is telling you your mind can't be trusted. Helen didn't save me by being heroic. She saved me by being honest. By looking at what was plainly in front of her and saying it out loud, even when it wasn't her place, even when I pulled my arm away, that kind of clear-eyed steadiness, the willingness to call a thing what it is and then do something about it. That's what actually holds a life together when someone is trying to take it apart. I'm still here. The tremor is gone. The garden at Dennis's place is going to look better in spring. Some things, it turns out, grow back.